Hello everyone, and welcome to my Blackathon and Contemporary-A-Thon reading wrap-up. I read a total of 14 books for these two readathons, 12 filled challenges for the Blackathon, and 9 filled challenges for Contemporary-A-Thon. First I'm going to give my thoughts on the books I read just for Blackathon, then I'll talk about the books that filled challenges for both readathons, and then I'll just talk about the final two that were just for Contemporary-A-Thon. The first book I'm going to talk about is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. This is a reread for me, although it's been a very long time since I originally read this book. I loved this book. I gave it 5 stars. If I were judging it just on the story alone, it'd be a 4 or 4.5, still really good. But the writing in this book is so flawlessly beautiful that I cannot give it anything less than a 5 star. The descriptions of the places and inanimate objects bring them so much to life and add so much to the experience and meaning of the book that anyone interested in studying the craft of writing absolutely needs to read this book just for that alone. I loved watching Janie's journey of self-discovery throughout the book and how she starts to spread her discoveries of happiness to others, especially Phoebe at the end. You can just see in their conversations how impactful Janie's journey is. In fact, that theme of self-discovery reminded me a lot of Jane Eyre, which I also recently reread. Just give me all of the books with female main characters going on a journey to discover themselves and reaching for their own happiness. Highly, highly recommend this book. Next is Afar by Leila Del Duca. This is a fantasy graphic novel about a girl who starts to travel to other worlds when she sleeps. I love the beginning of this graphic novel. It was so inventive. I love seeing the glimpses into the other worlds. The art was wonderful, and I really enjoyed it. However, I think because this is just a 1-volume graphic novel, the end just kind of shoved everything together to get to some kind of conclusion. This would have been a great series. I really want to see more of those other worlds and how the main character really deals with it. And I just thought that the end didn't do this story and this world justice. Overall, though, I did enjoy it and I gave it 4 stars. Next is a book I DNF'd, The Soul Cages by Nicole Givens Kurtz. The premise was interesting. It's about a girl who was enslaved in soul form and ends up freeing herself and trying to save her sister. But the writing was just really poor. The writing was stilted, there were tense changes, misspellings or wrong word endings, and a ton of repetition. It seemed like the writer was just getting started in writing, and like I said, I like the concept, but the execution really needed work. Next is The God Who Begat a Jackal by Nega Mezlekia, who's an Ethiopian author living in Canada now. This was a strange book. It takes place in historical Africa in a feudal system with elements of magic dispersed throughout. It has a very heavy folktale feel, and I thought that that was actually done really well. There's not much character growth, which usually is something that I'm really interested in, but because that folktale aspect was done so well, I was still very much engaged and invested in what was happening. I thought the balance was really good. The writing was gorgeous, the world building was really dense, and that mythic folktale aspect was almost hyperbolic, which made it kind of fun and quirky to read. I gave it 4 stars. Another book that I reread was a poetry book by Natasha Trethewey, Native Guard. I read this back in undergrad, and I remembered it being one of the few poetry collections that I was assigned that I actually enjoyed. Upon this reread, I found that yes, I really flipping enjoyed this book. The poems are so vivid, and the descriptions and words that are used are just so impactful. The crafting of the poems themselves are really gorgeous in how carefully and thoughtfully the author uses repetition or mirroring of stanzas and concepts. The collection as a whole focuses on the present with the author and her mother's story, and also on one of the first Black regiments in the Deep South called the Native Guard. The way that those two timelines and the themes from both timelines are woven together is masterful. Trethewey uses a lot of detailed descriptions of historical photographs to fantastically point out how different people looking at the same photograph can have such different interpretations. And as a whole, that whole interpretation of the photographs talks about interpretation of history and what that means, and when things are forgotten versus when things are remembered and by whom. Oh, it's so fantastic. And I found that in the physical copy that I own, there was actually a CD of the author reading her poems. So I actually listened to her readings of it, which was phenomenal. I cannot recommend this poetry collection enough. Next, I read Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I'm torn with this book. I've really liked Adichie's previous books that I've read, Half of a Yellow Sun and Purple Hibiscus. This one was good, and it had a lot of important things to say, but I thought that it fell a little bit flat in the two main characters and their story, especially at the end. It was good at the beginning, but I thought that the resolution was rushed. It focused more on this romance aspect that I didn't think fit with the first half of the book, and so the ending was really disappointing to me. Overall, I gave it 3 stars. Then I read 4 books by Jacqueline Woodson. I had read If You Come Softly back when I read basically my entire middle school library. I remember it being so impactful to my perception, my processing of race issues in this country. So I reread it and it broke me again. If someone were to ask me that question that kind of goes around sometimes about what book you think everyone should be required to read, this is it. If You Come Softly is my choice. Even though I knew what would happen in this book, Woodson's crafting of the relationships and the characters and their hopes and dreams made me feel like I was experiencing the story for the first time, even though I remembered one of the main things that happened. This book deals with so many identities and dynamics. It's got race, one of the main characters is Jewish, queerness, money, divorce, family, growing up and fitting in, and how all these things intersect with each other. It's got so many different relationships within families, within friendships, within romantic relationships, not just the two main characters who develop a relationship together, but also their parents and how those relationships, whether they worked out or don't, and in what ways they do and don't work out, affect how the two main teenage characters think about relationships. Oh, it's a phenomenal book. It's not that long, but it packs so much into it and makes the characters and their situations feel so real. And then when it gets to the end, that impact, because as a reader, you're just so invested in these very real feeling people, that impact takes a toll. Whew, does it take a toll? And then I read the sequel, Behind You, which is a continuation of the first book and an utterly gorgeous and heart-wrenching examination of grief from different people and how they deal with it. I cannot recommend these 2 books enough. The other 2 books I read by Jacqueline Woodson are I Hadn't Meant to Tell You This and Lena. These books deal with some heavy themes, content warning for sexual abuse, but they do it really well. I gave 3 stars to I Hadn't Meant to Tell You This. It was important to see 2 middle schoolers dealing with this issue. I just thought that there was something missing plot-wise to give it a thread of connection rather than the book seeming like a meandering slice of life. And I think that was further impacted in the fact that the point of view character in this book was a degree removed from the issue of the abuse. It was her friend who was dealing with the issue, and I think that degree of separation separated me as a reader even further from the story. However, in the sequel, we are reading from the perspective of that friend. As heart-wrenching as the topic is, the book handled it really, really well. There was a lot of hope infused in this book and in the main character and her sister finding people who would help them. And again, Woodson's gorgeous writing comes into play into both of these books. I gave Lena 4 stars. Then I read The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, and I did read this in the audio like so many people recommended, which was completely worth it. These poems were great. I loved the theme of duality that shows up throughout the book, both in Xiomara hiding her true self versus the self that she shows to her family and that her family expects her to be. I loved the way that we saw her first draft master her assignment and the differences in what she feels comfortable actually handing in. That poem that she wrote about her first period blew me away. The imagery and symbolism throughout the book is just so powerful. Another big hard hitter for me was the Medusa poem. This was really good, and I was invested in the character. I loved that the poetry format really did justice to the book itself. I thought the resolution in the climax was a little too smooth and a little less believable given all the tension that led up to it and the realism of changing perspectives in her mother especially, but overall I love this book. I gave it a 4.5 stars. Next, I actually DNF'd Let's Talk About Love by Claire Kann. I love that the main character is asexual and that the book handles that and what it means to her and how she's so tired of having to defend it all the time, but the romance aspect and a lot of her relationships with her boss and her best friend felt so strange to me. It was really, really frustrating to read. The characters were annoying. I do think that they were accurate for that age, the late teen, early college age range, but it was still annoying to read. There were a lot of asides in parentheses that were very repetitive and distracting. Alice's boss just crossed boundaries way too much, trying to set her up in a relationship, getting way too involved in her love life, and rating herself on Alice's scale of hotness. It was so inappropriate. Alice's family is terrible. They don't listen to her. They don't respect her. They're trying to control her. It's not called out, and trying to pass that control off as love was not working for me. So I DNF'd it. I did give it 2 stars just because I did think it had important things to say, but there were too many things in this book that I couldn't get over. Next, I read Girl Meets Boy by Ali Smith. This is a retelling of a Greek myth in which a girl falls in love with another girl, laments that they can't get married because it's same sex, and the gods basically turn her into a man so that they can be happily ever after. This was a strange book. It's written in prose, but it has a very poetic feel to it that I really enjoyed. But a lot of that type of abstract writing turned into more stream of consciousness, which I cannot stand. Overall, though, I did enjoy it, and the points that it had to make about queerness, family, love, rebellion, and so on. I gave it 3 stars. And lastly, I read The Tea Chest by Josephine Moon. This is a contemporary chick lit book that takes place between Australia and England about a woman who has been working in a tea shop in Australia and she's looking to expand in England. Normally, I do not read chick lit, but I couldn't pass on the opportunity to read about a tea store, and the book did heavily focus on tea and the comfort of it, and that just fits my aesthetic perfectly. But I ended up really enjoying the characters. I thought it had a lot of good things to say about feminism and relationships. The book follows 3 main female characters, and they're in various points of their lives and different relationship types, different dreams, and how they all work together to get this shop up and running and the obstacles that they face. One of the main characters was in a bad relationship, and I was really worried for a long time that the book would try to pass off forgiveness for the guy for the awful stuff that he did. But it didn't. It really did focus on making sure a woman is in a positive, healthy relationship for herself. I really appreciated that. I really enjoyed it. If you like contemporary, especially if you want to get that lovely tea shop aesthetic, I highly recommend it. I gave it 4 stars. The last challenge for a Blackathon was to watch 4 spoken word poems on YouTube. I did watch those. My favorite, I would probably say, was Waiting. Close runner-up would be Bilenoptera. Let me know down in the comments if you read any of these books, what you thought on those spoken word poems, if you participated in Blackathon and Contemporary-A-Thon. Thanks for joining me.